So hello everyone, welcome to the LFS ACE Team's Is Grad School Right For Me event. Thank you for joining us today virtually. My name is Monique. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I will be your host today. We have some facilitators from the LFS ACE team that will be monitoring the chat and answering questions throughout the event. I would first like to take a moment to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. As we learn about graduate schools and learning opportunities from various places, both near and far, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands, and I encourage you to learn about them. The LFS ACE team is a group of LFS students focused on delivering programs and events related to academic success and career development. For today's event, we will start by learning a bit more about applying to grad schools from our guest speaker, Danielle, followed by a Q&A session. Then we'll welcome our guest speakers, Kim and Rachel. They will answer questions regarding their grad school experiences. And I encourage everyone to ask questions as other students in the event probably have the same ones. Then we'll finish up with some closing remarks, and then that will be our event for today. I'm pleased to welcome Danielle, a career and professional development educator at the Center for Student Involvement and Careers, to share us her insights on applying for grad school. We have included a QR code for each of the speakers' LinkedIns for today's event. Danielle, feel free to share your slides.
Thank you, folks. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the LFS ACE team for organizing this event. I think you should be able to see my slides. Just before I dive in, I will mention, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I will share the slides after today's presentation, so you'll have access to those. And if you are looking for more support after today's session, either you'd like someone to give you feedback on a grad school application or have an advising appointment one-to-one about grad school and career planning or other topics, feel free to get in touch with the center. And that's something myself and my colleagues do offer. In terms of my presentation today, I just wanted to offer a little bit of context and some kind of major topics that tend to come up around grad school. And one thing I think is really important to start off with is that there's actually different types of grad programs. And I think understanding a little bit more about those differences can be really helpful in deciding what you might want to apply to and also how to go about that application. The good news is you will have two panelists who represent two different types of programs, so also can hear some great strategies from them a little bit later. But generally speaking, the first category of grad school that I tend to think of are research-based programs. These are often the programs where you will be writing a thesis, working with a supervisor. You may start with a master's program and progress to the PhD. Pretty much anyone who is doing a PhD is doing a research-based programs. There are also research-based master's programs. The goal of these programs, as they sound like, is to produce new knowledge within a field. So depending on what your academic discipline is, what constitutes new knowledge will look a little bit different. But what's really exciting about these programs is you will be doing, innovative research, trying to answer a research question and developing insight or information that is unique and innovative. Professional programs are a little bit different. I didn't include law here, but you are going to be hearing from Kim a little bit later about law as another great example of a professional program. Or another way to think about it might be kind of a regulated program. So there are some career paths, law, medicine, pharmacy, dentistry, where the requirements to actually practice in that profession are quite controlled. You have to have a degree from an accredited program. There's a very good reason for that. I want to know that if I'm talking to a lawyer or going to a dentist, that person's training has met certain standards. So these are a little bit different in how they're set up. You usually aren't doing a research project in quite the same way. You're taking courses, you're fulfilling certain requirements within that program so that at the end you will be able to get certified or licensed or whatnot and actually practice in that profession. And then finally, this third category is kind of the one that has the most variety in it. And I think of these as course-based, or sometimes you'll hear the term professional masters. A master's of public health, which is what Rachel is studying, might be a good example of this. I'm not sure, Rachel, if your program has a thesis or not. But these professional masters are kind of in the middle. I think of them as the ones that are designed to give people skills that they can transfer to the world of employment. So they typically don't have quite that same research focus. Master of Data Science is preparing someone presumably to work as a data scientist. They're learning lots of skills to help them do that. But the profession of being a data scientist isn't regulated in quite the same way as medicine or law is. If you have more questions about that, happy to talk about it, but I think it's just a really useful thing to consider that not all quote unquote grad programs mean the same things. They actually have very different goals. And as we move towards thinking about the application, you would probably do some slightly different things depending on what type of program you're applying to. If you are thinking about grad school, which I'm going to guess that you are if you're here today, I think it's really, really important to make that decision intentionally. The panelists might share a bit about how they came to their decision that they wanted to go to grad school and what program and why it was right for them. There are many reasons why you might want to go to grad school. You might really love your academic discipline. You might have a research question you're really passionate about answering. Another reality, of course, is that you might be interested in certain career paths that are easier to access or maybe only accessible by completing grad school. But I do think it's really helpful to, I'll say, interrogate that assumption a little bit. So if there is a type of work or a career path that's interesting to you, it's worth looking at some job postings, talking to some people who work in that profession, doing some research to just make sure, is a grad degree actually necessary to work in that field? In some cases, law being an excellent example, yes, if you want to work as a lawyer, you will be going to law school, but many other types of work are actually more flexible. There may be multiple ways to enter into that career path, and that's just really good to know so that you could decide, does grad school still make sense to me? You can also think about what you want to gain from that grad school experience. Not all programs are set up the same way. Even, the same program. Rachel, I didn't realize you were studying in Toronto, so I did a little bit of research into the UBC Master of Public Health program. And even though they might both be masters in public health programs, they may actually be set up differently. So it's helpful to know, do you really want to do a practicum or a co-op within your grad studies? Do you want to work with a certain tool or get a certain type of training? What's important to you about your grad school experience? And that can help you figure out what program or what school might be the right choice. And then one other thing I want to flag, because it comes up, I think, in conversations with students, is when. So it's sort of, there's this question of, is grad school right for me? But also, is grad school right for me right now? And I think there's a bit of a myth that the only time to go to grad school, or the only time it's a good idea to go to grad school, is right after completing undergrad. That's actually what I did. I went straight from my bachelor's to my master's and then my PhD. There might very well be good reasons to do that, but I think there can also be really good reasons to potentially work, do other things, explore, and in most cases, it will still be very possible to return to school. One of my best friends who actually completed her PhD probably 7 or 8 years ago just started at law school this fall. When I do our grad school orientations every fall, there are people who have worked for 2, 3, 5, 10 years and then come back to grad school. So just something to think about. Is it right for you? And is now the right moment to do that? It might be, but it doesn't mean the door is closed if you decide to explore work, do other things, and potentially come back to school later in life. I want to touch a little bit on the application, and I believe our panelists will speak to this as well, but some common aspects of the application that might come up. Depending on the program, you might be asked to provide either a resume or a CV. I know the language of CV can be a little bit confusing. It's pretty similar to a resume. If you have an existing resume, that probably is a really good place to start from. But sometimes you'll find that it's a little bit more focused on research and academic achievements. So this might mean moving the sections around a little bit. It might mean including some slightly different information. It might be that the documents just gets longer because you have more space and they want to hear more details. So there aren't really tons of differences between a resume and a CV at kind of the undergrad or master's level, but just something to think about. You might be asked to provide that document. And you will probably also be asked for something that sounds like a statement of intent or a personal statement or a proposal. They will use slightly different terms depending on the program you're applying to, but some sort of written statement as part of your application. What you're asked to cover in that document will again depend on your program. The panelists might talk about what they put in theirs. It's just something to think about that it usually does require some time and some effort to put together. It involves thinking about yourself, about your goals for why you're going to grad school. It involves doing some research and being knowledgeable about the program. So it's something you want to give yourself time. If you are thinking about grad school applications, I would, start early so that you have time to spend some time on some of those pieces. And just to build on that idea of that document, whether it's a personal statement or a statement of intent, think about the person who's going to be reading this. In many cases, that will be professors who are in the department you're applying to. It might also be professionals working in the field. What is going to be important to them? And when you think about the goal of the program, are you telling them about yourself as a future professional? So if I was applying to medicine or School of Social Work, I would really want to present myself as someone who can be successful in that profession. I might talk about relevant experiences, things I've done. On the other hand, if I'm applying to do a master's in biology, what's going to be really important is showing my knowledge of biology and also that I'm interested in research questions and research projects, that I can come up with an interesting project. The other thing that I usually get lots of questions about just before we wrap up is reference letters. So you will almost certainly be asked to provide some reference letters as part of your application. Probably more than 1, 2, or 3 kind of seem to be the common numbers. And depending again on the program that you're applying to, they might ask for academic references, which usually means someone who has taught you in a class, so a professor or an instructor, or professional references, which could be like a boss or a supervisor, someone that you volunteered with, or you might be able to have a combination of both. So that's going to depend on your program. But if you are asking for reference letters, I think you just want to be respectful of people's time. So ask early so that they have time to write you a letter. Think about someone who knows you well enough that they can comment, on your skills, but also at the same time, if they don't have to be someone you've known for 5 years, or you don't have to be best friends, just someone, who has a sense of who you are as a researcher, as a student, as a professional, what they might be able to say about you. And then I think give them all the information to make that process as easy as possible. If there's links or information that they need to submit those references, I think the smoother the process is, the better. You will get those slides, as I mentioned. I put some links in here in terms of some samples of some of these statements and some resources. And as I mentioned, the CSINC is also happy to support you as you're working on your applications, if that helps. I will turn to questions just in a moment, but in general, when I think about grad school, and especially, is this grad school right for me question, there is often more than one path to the same goals. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, it's helpful to talk to other people. It's helpful to think about what are the different ways that this could play out. taking that time to reflect on what's important to you and also research opportunities and strategies is really helpful. And then I think it's helpful to just name this. If you go ahead and submit that application, there will be a waiting period. It's pretty long. It's often a few months. So there will be some uncertainty. But I think if it's something that you feel drawn to or something you want to explore, there are a lot of resources and ways to get support with that application. I will do a quick pause there. Any questions coming up that anyone wants to ask?
We have a question in the chat asking, are most master programs 4 years long?
Oh, good question. I would say 4 years is going to be pretty long for a master's, so depends on the structure of the program. If it is more course-based, then it's usually pretty defined. I've seen master's programs that are as short as 9 months. 12 months is also a very real possibility. If you're writing a thesis, the length becomes a bit more variable because it kind of depends on how long it takes you to get your research done. But I would say kind of around 2-ish, 2.5 years seems to be the average. And many programs, if you look at their website, will actually tell you the average time to complete. So I think kind of 2 to 3 would probably be more common.
And if anyone has any questions for Daniel, feel free to comment them in the chat, or you can raise your hand. It's in the participants, in the reactions raise hand function. It's in there, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, someone just raised their hand, Selena.
Hi, Daniel. I have a question about reference letter because I know the reference letter are like they have to be sent from the prof or like the boss directly to the application. So I was wondering like how long before the application should we asking for the reference letter would be like more appropriate. So like it's not like too early or like too late.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So usually the application will tell you kind of when it quote unquote opens. So there will be a point at which people start to be able to submit. That's really good information to tell someone that they'll be able to start submitting their letters on November 15th or whenever it is, and then when that window closes. So maybe they have between November 15th and January 15th to submit their letter, and they can do it anywhere in there. Generally speaking, I think you want to ask people ideally a month or 2 before the deadline. And it's just kind of mean, but as you might know, a lot of deadlines for grad school applications are sometimes in December and January, which is a really busy time as a student and a really busy time as a professor. So if you know that your grad school applications have deadlines in like mid-December when profs are busy trying to mark exams and finish a semester, I think like late October, even early November is a good time to ask so that they know and they can maybe do those letters ahead of time.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Another question. Sorry.
We have a question in the chat about what a fellowship is.
So it can mean different things in different contexts. It can mean a type of funding. So someone might be awarded a fellowship as a grad student or towards their grad studies, which can mean money basically that you get to be a grad student, which is nice. Sometimes being a postdoc or a postdoctoral fellow is referred to as a fellowship. And that's something that typically happens after someone has completed their PhD. So another type of research-based training that comes at the very end. And then the other term in which I've heard fellowship is in some types of medical training as a certain stage that you progress through, especially as you're doing your specialization. So it would depend a little bit on context, what that means exactly.
Couple more questions pop up. There's one question asking what actions can we start to take as a second-year student?
Oh, that's such a good question. Again, I think it depends a little bit on what types of program you're interested in. If you think you're interested in research, I would look for opportunities to potentially get involved with research. So you might be able to volunteer in a lab or with a professor, go to office hours, talk to your professors, learn a little bit about their research and opportunities they might have. There's also, and this is just coming up, I'll put the link in after I'm done speaking, but MERC, or the Multidisciplinary Undergraduate Research Conference, happens every winter. Undergrads can actually present their research. So if you're thinking research, basically just getting involved in research. If you're thinking about more professional programs, if you think, I might want to work as a counselor or a pharmacist or whatever it is, then I would be thinking about ways to get exposure to that field. Can you job shadow? Do you know anyone who does that type of work? Would they be able to talk with you a little bit about their job and what they do? Is there relevant volunteer or work opportunities that look sort of similar to that? I know lots of professional program, one of the things they're interested in is, have you done volunteering or job shadowing or anything that's sort of similar to that? Of course, you could do a combination of those things, but your strategy might look a little bit different depending on the type of program you're most interested in. And also, I'll just say it, try to get the best grades you can. The academic transcript will be part of your grad school application. Your more third and fourth year grades will typically matter more, but certainly a strong academic record is going to be helpful.
Due to the stress of time, I think we'll do one more question and then we'll head on to the next section. The question is, how might a master's program overlap or connect with the co-op program?
Oh, good question. So some master's programs will just have a co-op component. And in my experience, what that typically looks like is you, from September to April, you do classes, and then from May to August, you're in a co-op term. They will support you usually with setting up those placements. You usually do have to apply to them, and they're still competitive, but they will usually have some partners that they work with. So in some cases, it might just be sort of built into the program, and that's what you do for one semester of the program. Another route is there are some master's programs where the co-op is more optional, and I think that is then often adding a term on. So you do 3 semesters of coursework and thesis, and then either you graduate or you choose to do a 4th semester of co-op. And again, you'd probably go through some sort of application process to get that co-op placement.
Thank you, Danielle, for your insights about applying to grad school.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Now we'll go into welcoming our speakers, Kim and Rachel, who are graduate students at Allard Law School and at University of Toronto. We'll start with Kim with her introduction.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Kim. I currently go to Allard. I did my undergrad at UBC, and I'm going to be talking about the path to law school today. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so here is my essentially history. So as I mentioned, I did an FNH degree. This took me 5 years to do because I was involved with the co-op program for UBC Science. I did 2 terms at the obesity medicine clinic. It's in the same complex as Natural Factors, if you're familiar, in Coquitlam, and it was absolutely amazing. It was much more patient care related, but given that it was directly applicable to my undergrad major, I really wanted to involve myself in something similar. So I did that. And then after 5 years, I graduated. I took a gap year, and that's the year where I worked at a law firm and got some work experience. That's also the same year I took the LSAT, which I'll talk about later as well. And then after my 1 gap year, I began law school in 2020, and I'm now in my 2nd year. And in law school, we call 2nd year students 2 Ls, 1st year students 1 L. So if I use that colloquially during the rest of the presentation, that's just what I'm referring to. And then this summer, I'll be working at DLA Piper, for those of you who are familiar with the law firms in the country. And yeah, we can go to the next slide. All right, so I get this question a lot as a science student who transitioned to law. And so essentially these are some of the major reasons why I wanted to make the switch into this, into the legal field. I really liked all the client-facing interactions that I had with my work experience. I have a background as a server. I had clinical experience. I had patient care, and just a lot of retail as well. And so I knew I wanted something to that effect. The path that I felt like I was headed with my nutrition degree didn't involve as much client-facing interaction as what I really was looking for. And so that was also one of my reasons for making the switch. I really had a tough time, with the creative aspect of nutrition. I just felt like I wanted something that was much more, problem solving in that nature. And so I felt like the law was a really good fit for me. I really like looking at problems and trying to understand the reasons why something works the way that it does, the reasoning behind something that's suggested. I was also really interested in policy, and I thought that the law definitely governs that aspect. So, and then there's a lot of research skills as well. A lot of people don't know this, but Bachelor of Science students tend to do very well in law school, and that's just purely because you're not thinking about writing a lot of fluff and research papers and trying to figure out, what word sounds best in a paper and making it sound as eloquent as possible. We're really taught to speak as succinctly as possible and just get to the point and remove as much fluff as possible. So that really serves you well in law school. And so the research skills in that respect. And then obviously earning potential was something that I was considering as well. And so I knew I wanted a job that had good financial stability, and the law definitely gives you that. So those are my reasons. And then we can go to the next slide. So to become a lawyer in Canada specifically, there's a lot of steps, as you can see. So you don't technically need to complete an undergraduate degree. You need to have at least 3 years though. So that's 90 credits in literally anything. Like I did nutrition, as I just said, and some of my peers have done things like, I know someone who did opera, and they got a bachelor through that. And so they applied. I know a lot of computer science students, engineering, and yeah, it's really varied. So truly anything that you have your undergraduate degree in, you can absolutely apply to law school with that. And so once you obtain your degree, you're going to need to do the LSAT. There is no limit to the number of times you can take the LSAT. I know in the past there used to be. So if this is something that you're thinking about, it might be a good idea to, look into the steps that would take to study for an exam like the LSAT. Very different from the MCAT, but kind of the same process as that. Then you need to apply and get into a law school within Canada, and that's where you would get your JD degree, which is 3 years. Once you graduate, though, you're still not a lawyer. You have to go through this articling period, which is about a year, roughly 10 months to 12 months, depending on where you go. And at the end of that articling period, you have to pass the bar course in the specific province that you wish to practice in. So I plan on practicing in BC, in Vancouver specifically. And so I have to do the bar course for BC. If I wanted to go to Ontario later on in my career, I'd have to rewrite the bar again in Ontario in order to be able to practice law in that province. So once I do that, then I'll be a licensed lawyer. So a few more years to go. And then we can go to the next slide. So in Canada, we're actually quite lucky. There's a ton of law schools, 3 in BC, 20 across the country. And as I mentioned, this is a 3-year program that leads you to a JD. There's some programs that give you an LLB, but to my knowledge, none of the Canadian law schools will give you an LLB. That's mostly in the UK, I believe, and it's not exactly the same. Most schools will give you the option to do a 4-year JD MBA if that's something that interests you. I didn't really feel a need to do that, so I didn't really apply, but that's definitely an option. And then you can just get it done in 4 years. And then, as I mentioned, apply to law school in the province you want to work in because of the bar reasons. And so I personally knew I really wanted to go to law school, and I did not want anything to stop me. So I personally applied to a lot of law schools in Canada. I think I applied to 10. And so I definitely applied to law schools. I think I applied to Dalhousie, Toronto, everywhere. And so this part wasn't as important to me because I knew a lot of people who could transfer to UBC or UVic. And so I didn't want to close it off, and I knew that I definitely wanted to go to law school. So I definitely applied broadly. But again, you know, if you are very settled on only wanting to practice in BC, it may be a more viable option to apply to UBC, UVic, and TRU, which are the 3 law schools in BC. And then also something really good to note is that many of the schools are going to eliminate your worst credits or take your best 2 or 3 years. I know U of T Law will take your best 3 years, and University of Alberta will take your best 2 years. UBC specifically for Allard, they will eliminate your worst 12 credits. And so this was really great for me because I did not do that well in Bio 200, and it still haunts me to this day. And so if you're upset about, you know, an OChem mark, for example, do not worry. Do not let that be the reason why you don't apply, because it won't even factor into the GPA that they use to admit you. So we can go to the next slide. And so I'm going to be speaking specifically about Allard just because that's the school that I go to. Other schools may be a little bit different, but these are the stats. So if you're applying to Allard, they're going to want your personal statement, your transcripts, and your LSAT score. As I mentioned, you can take the LSAT as many times as you want. Some schools may interpret that to be a bad thing, but I know UBC doesn't. And so there's 3 categories that you can apply to. General, the Indigenous category, or the discretionary category. And for the Indigenous and discretionary categories, you're going to need a reference letter. And so given that I applied broadly to all the schools, some of the schools in the East Coast that I applied to required reference letters. And so I know that we were discussing this a little bit earlier, but in that respect, I think it's really important that you ask for reference letters as soon as you can. The year that I was going to apply, I think it was in my 4th year, and I knew I was going to do a gap year. I had told my referees, my potential referees, that I was interested in them having to write me a reference letter the very beginning of summer. And I gave them a deadline of the end of November, even though the deadline was December, just because I was very anxious that something was going to happen and somebody was going to be late. I just really wanted to be on the safe side. So that's kind of the timeline that I worked with, and everything went really well. And so as mentioned, you can apply after you've got 90 credits done. You don't necessarily have to graduate, but it's highly preferred, and I've heard this from the admissions committee, that you do complete your degree prior to going to law school. They won't really say this, but this is actually like seen to be not really kind of a negative in a way, because you don't really have you know, all the criteria that the other ones do. Like, for example, I feel really happy that I can add BSc at the end of my name. If you did 3 years, you wouldn't really be able to do that. And so that's also something to consider. Competitive applicants generally have an 83% GPA and a 166 LSAT. This 83% is not including the worst credits. And so drop those, and that's what the GPA that they will be using to calculate will look like. And so we can go to the next slide. So some things I wish I knew before. I alluded to this earlier, but a Bachelor of Science prepares you very well. I know that there's this common understanding that most law students, you know, did fine arts and a Bachelor of Arts. It's really not that, it's much more diverse than you think it is. So yeah, don't be set off by that. There's a lot of reading involved, which I actually liked, because as a science student, I was very used to doing a lot of labs and, you know, homework in that domain. And so there's a lot more reading involved, which is nice because it's not as brain exhausting. It's just really just read whatever is assigned to you, but there is a ton. Another thing I feel like needs to be talked about a little bit more is that you are graded on a curve amongst your peers, which is very difficult when you're talking about, you know, some of the smartest people in the applicant pool. Like everyone I go to at school, everyone I go to school with is incredibly smart, incredibly brilliant. That's just the kind of, demographic that law school attracts. And so it's very tough to be graded on a curve. But on the other hand, no one can fail. And so it's really a double-edged sword. So it depends how you're looking at it. So if you didn't study for an exam, for example, you're likely not going to fail because the curve will save you, but it's incredibly difficult to be at the top of your class. And then another thing is time management. In undergrad, I took at most 5 courses at one time while balancing a lot of extracurriculars. Law school is 7 courses all at the same time, and it's a lot. So you really have to be really on top of your time management skills. And so I would say that that's absolutely imperative. And then this can also lead to a lot of high pressure. So you don't have any assignments, but instead you have 100% final exams. I will say though, that in your first year of law school, when grades matter the most, your December exams are fail safe. And so whatever mark you get on them won't count as long as you do better in April. So you can use that as a learning experience. But, to some, it does sound scary that your entire mark is just dependent on one exam. But, it's funny, my mom, when I told her about this, she was like, oh, you just have to do well once. So it really depends how you're interpreting that. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so I forgot when my slides ended, but yeah, that's it. And let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Kim. We're actually going to go into Rachel's introduction first, and then we'll have the Q&A session after. Just 1 second for that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Delaney, for sharing the slides, and thanks for having me today. My name is Rachel. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently in my first year in the Master of Public Health program in the Health Promotion stream at the University of Toronto's Dalhousie School of Public Health. So it's interesting because I am only a couple of months into my program myself, but I'm very excited to kind of share and walk you through kind of my application process as well as what I've been learning so far. So next slide, please. I'm grateful that we did a live acknowledgement for UBC, but since I am currently in Toronto, I also wanted to acknowledge that I am personally joining from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credits. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, and is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. It's a great privilege to be able to live and learn on this land, and I just wish to pay my respects to the elders and Indigenous communities from across Turtle Island. Next slide, please. Just a little snapshot of my academic journey so far. So I did my undergrad at UBC in the Food, Nutrition, and Health General stream with a minor in psychology, and I actually just graduated in June. And I listed up some things I was involved with, such as the LFS US, Imagine Day, LFS ACE, which has been really wonderful opportunities for me. And I also did an exchange semester at the University of Copenhagen during 2020. So we all know what happened there. That's why I wrote kind of for an exchange, because I ended up actually doing most of it in my own bedroom in Vancouver remotely. But now I am currently in Toronto at the University of Toronto, like I mentioned, and my Master of Public Health. We have different streams, which I'll talk about a little later on, but my stream is Social and Behavioral Health Sciences, also known as Health Promotion. Next slide, please. So why public health? Can skip to next slide. I wanted to briefly mention some of my interests coming into the program, which surprisingly has been changing and evolving the more that I'm part of this new learning environment. But very briefly, some of my career interests are around health equity, newcomers health, cancer prevention, and community development. And these are all topics that are very much relevant to the public health discipline, and I feel that I would be able to further explore through graduate school. And yeah, it's really interesting when I reflect that even compared to just 2 months ago, my interests seem to be widening and changing just with the content that I've been able to engage with in this program. And chatting a little bit more about my path from LFS to public health. Something that I really love about having been part of LFS is that our learnings can really lead us into all different career and research directions with the breadth of the topics in our curriculum and the versatile skills that we're able to build throughout our degree. And my decision to pursue further education in public health is really a reflection of the experiences and exposure to new ideas brought to me by my LFS undergrad. I mentioned that I was in the F&H general major, and part of that decision was for the flexibility to be taking electives that interested me. And for myself, I naturally gravitated towards ones that cover topics in community and population health. One of the examples of an elective that I took during my second year was SBPH 301, which is understanding the social determinants of health. And this is really core to kind of my initial interest towards public health. And I just found it extremely revelating to conceptualize health in a different way, shifting from a biomedical perspective, which is very much biological and individually based, to an upstream view that really gives merits to the conditions where people live, work, play, and grow in. And this is also known as the social determinants of health. And these factors very much affects the opportunities and resources that communities have, as well as their health outcomes. And that's public health and kind of what really drew me towards this field. And of course, being an LFS, a lot of our curriculum centers around the whole idea of systems thinking. And so I was definitely interested in seeing how that can be applied in a population health kind of discipline. And community-based learning was another kind of driver from LFS into public health because of the many opportunities where I was able to work on the ground. I really found an interest in the opportunity to work with diverse community settings and classes, such as through things like CBEL and the LFS 496 career development course in LFS, for example. And I really found my interest there working with community members to be able to create sustainable programs and solutions to issues that most impact them. And lastly, like the learning environment in LFS that I most loved and valued, public health is also a field that is interdisciplinary in nature. And I strongly feel that my LFS undergrad equipped me to think in a cross-disciplinary capacity, as well as being able to work highly collaboratively. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit more about my program specifically, just because every graduate program is very different, which Danielle has talked about, with things like being research versus course-based and professional. And also it may also vary depending on the institution. And so the best place to find the specific information is always on the program websites of the degrees that you're interested in. But in terms of the MPH Health Promotion Program at the University of Toronto, we actually have different stream specializations that we pick upon application. So for me, I am in health promotion, but other possibilities within the U of T MPH program include epidemiology, occupational and environmental health, nutrition and dietetics, etc. Whereas other schools like UBC will have one general stream instead. So that kind of differs depending on where you are. And health promotion, I just put a definition here, is the process of enabling people to increase control over and to improve their health. And this is from the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, which is very core to my studies. I just wanted to put that out there because sometimes people think of health promotion as just health education, teaching people how to have healthy lifestyle habits and all of that. But it's actually a process that also involves things like how do we build public policy that are supportive of people's health, conducive of people's well-being? How do we strengthen community actions and orient health services to be able to meet the needs of the communities? If you're interested, you can feel free to check out the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. It's pretty lengthy, as well as some other kind of more milestone documents around health promotion. But for my program, it is a 2-year program if you do it on a full-time basis. And it is course-based, which Danielle has mentioned. For professional programs, some of them don't require a thesis, and this is an example of that. So rather than doing a major research project, I will instead be doing a practicum, I haven't done mine yet. It's actually coming up in the summer from May to August. So it's a 16-week full-time kind of experience over the summer. And something unique to Dalalana is that we have an optional second practicum during our second year. So during the winter semester of my last year, I'm able to do another work experience in lieu of doing courses. But that just depends on kind of where your interests are, whether you want to take more courses or if you want to get a little bit more of hands-on work experience. So that's a little bit more about the program. And in terms of the application process, again, it varies depending on the institution, but for my program, there are several documents that you have to submit, which includes the letter of intent, a CV, letters of references, and for U of T, I just see a message from Monique here. Oh, sounds good. Yeah, so for the U of T Dalalana program, it was required for us to have 2 academic references, and that will depend on your program, of course, as well as transcripts. And in terms of what's assessed, you can see that they are pretty much parallel to what you submit. And for DLSPH, they emphasize that all 5 components are taken into consideration. So I would highly recommend and encourage everyone that grades are very important for graduate school, but it's definitely not the only component that we look at. Your experiences and your background are also very highly valued, and being in LFS, I think our interdisciplinary background and the skills that we build throughout our degree will really give us an edge in terms of applying to a social science master, such as the Master of Public Health. So I am aware that we are running short on time, so I think I will skip over the section just so we can have a bit more time in the Q&A. But yeah, I guess I'll just open up the floor back to the host.
Thank you, Rachel and Kim. We're gonna have a Q&A session now. So if anyone has questions for Rachel or Kim or even Danielle, feel free to leave it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and turn on your mics.
I have a question for Rachel. What kind of career path could you take with your master's degree in public health?
That's a great question. And the answer is all sorts of career paths. I guess because public health, there's a huge breadth of topics. It really depends on which topic you want to work in, as well as the sector. And so through like the practicum, even within the practicum, there are opportunities working in research, for example, or working in policy or even nonprofits. So it really is drastically different depending on your interests. And I guess like personally, I am interested in working in a more community-based setting. Like I kind of alluded to my interest in working in newcomers health. So one of the examples that of a potential kind of career setting for me is to work at a place like a community center or a neighborhood house where I can create health promotion programming with a very multi-ethnic, multi-diverse community. That's kind of where I see myself leaning towards. But yeah, so you know, the sky's the limit. I know that's very vague, but hopefully that gives you some sort of idea of, yeah, the possibilities with a Master of Public Health.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat asking for Kim. What is the discretionary category for law?
So that's the category that you would apply to if, for example, you know, something happened where your like grades suffered in a certain period of your academic history, and you have, for example, medical documentation or a really good valid reason as to why it did. So, you know, let's say like one year you had an injury, for example, and your grades really suffered as a result, you would just get medical documentation and also apply with that for your application. And so it's technically a more broader assessment of your application.
There's a question in the chat for Rachel from Parisa asking for some tips on writing the letter of intent, as she is also interested in the same program at U of T, and also what it was like transitioning from and moving from Vancouver to Toronto.
Yeah, so for my letter of intent, I think the biggest advice is to start as early as you can and make good use of tools such as things like concept maps. I would say that every school looks for slightly different kind of questions or prompts for their statements. So be sure that while you may be applying to multiple schools and may have overlaps in your letter of intent, but at the end of the day, like what you submit to that institution actually answers the questions that they ask for. Yeah, I would say start early, as well as I think it's really helpful to get a second pair of eyes when it comes to your letters. So for myself, I really spent multiple months working on it and was able to bring in my mentors, my friends, as well as people like Danielle, I'm sure will be able to support this process, as well as Rob Kim, who really helped me as well in giving feedback. So I would say those two are my biggest tips when it comes to writing your letter of intent. And I guess like the last thing is, I know a lot of us will be writing about our strengths and what we can bring to the table, but something to consider is also what makes you unique and how you see this program will be pivotal to your career paths. Because as much as the school wants to know how qualified you are, they also are interested in knowing how this program will benefit you, and being able to articulate that gives you a sense of purpose in applying to the program. And I think will be very important to showing your genuine kind of interest in pursuing further education in the field. I also see a second question in regards to moving and transitioning to Toronto from Vancouver. Frankly, I moved here just a few weeks ago, so I'm still transitioning. I think I complain a lot about the weather, but in terms of the city, I've been really enjoying it, and it's been nice getting to know some of the faces in my program as well. So that was really nice, but I'll keep you updated if I, once I settle down and get to experience the city a bit more.
So I got a direct message from someone who would like to be anonymous. So I'll just answer broadly. They're wondering if taking a lack of taking full courses during their undergrad, if there's a recommendation or a way to prove that you can meet the 7-course requirement in law school, or even to prove to yourself. And I would say that there's so many ways that you can do this. So that's definitely not a problem. One of the ways that a lot of my classmates did this was they spoke to the ways in which they balance school with part-time work. I myself, when I was taking 4 courses at one period of time, I was also a server, so I was working at the same time. And so there's definitely various ways that you can speak to your ability to meet that standard. And so I wouldn't be discouraged if you've been taking less courses at all. And then I also see another question. It's about, if I knew I wanted to go to law school throughout my FNH degree. And actually, to be quite honest with you, I wanted to go to pharmacy initially. And so I came to UBC with the intention of doing that. But, after doing co-op, I kind of understood where my likes and dislikes were. I would really recommend doing the co-op program, by the way, if that's something that, interests you. It's a really good way to understand and kind of reaffirm whether or not you're on the right track career-wise. It was definitely like a great thing for me. But yeah, I found out after my co-op experience and definitely after my law firm work experience. So it definitely took me time to implement myself into that situation to really understand, because law school is a very big commitment financially and time-wise. So you want to be sure before you go into that.
And then a more general question for the both of you. What are your tips for finding a good reference? We'll start with Rachel.
Sure, yeah. So for the programs that I applied for, some required strictly academic references, whereas others also allowed for work references. But in general, for a professional course-based program, academic references are preferred. In general, I would say a good referee is someone who can speak very strongly for you and your academic potential, as well as your character, work ethics, and just overall someone who has knowledge of you from multiple perspectives. And so I think one thing to consider is that you have multiple references. So how can they each bring in a different perspective that highlights your strengths according to what the program is looking for? I think that would be my general tips. Kim, feel free to pitch in.
Yeah, I mean, I asked 3 people for references. One of them was somebody that I had an extremely great relationship with. It was actually my supervisor in my co-op program. Her and I still keep in touch. She was a fantastic person because I knew she would speak very well of my character, and so I needed that. The second person was actually my Math 105 prof, purely because that was a class where I went to office hours all the time, and I had gotten to be on a first name basis with my prof. So that relationship definitely continued throughout my later years of my undergraduate program. And then my third one was the prof for a course that I got one of the highest marks that I did on my transcript. To be honest, that one was probably not my strongest reference letter. So if there's one thing that I would take away from that is prioritize the relationship you have with the person you're asking from rather than the mark you got in the class.
And just very quickly, I wanted to mention that when you're reaching out to your references, I think it's totally fine to let them know why you are asking them specifically, what you think that their reference would be able to show for you. So even providing supplemental documents such as a paper that you wrote in their class or a summary of skills that showed up in your work relationship or volunteer commitment with them. I think those will be really good to also provide in that initial reach out and to get them into a chat to be able to share more about why you're applying to the program and why you think that their reference is something that will support your process.
Thank you, Kim and Rachel. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for the Q&A session. So I hope you guys were able to get a chance to get your questions answered and connect with our speakers today. If you'd like to continue your conversations with the speakers, Selena, if you could share your screen, we have their LinkedIn accounts on the board. Probably take a few seconds, but thank you all for coming to our ACE team event today. And thank you to our speakers, Rachel, Kim, and Danielle, for sharing your experience and insights about graduate school. I hope this event was helpful for you and you were able to learn more about grad school. Please take a few minutes to complete our exit survey. The link will be sent in the chat, or you can scan this QR code on the screen. This will give us, please give us your thoughts and feedback on today's event. And again, I'd like to thank everyone involved in today's event, and I wish you all the best. Take care.
There's a questions in the chat regarding the recordings.